The morning began like any other. The Charleston air was cool and crisp, the sun just beginning to rise behind the old Spanish moss trees lining the sidewalk. At exactly 8:03 a.m., Serena Whitfield stepped out of her silver Buick and closed the driver's side door with practiced grace. She adjusted the collar of her navy pool blazer and clutched a slim, worn leather portfolio in one hand. Her heels clicked softly against the stone steps leading to the Charleston Federal Courthouse, each tap a quiet act of presence. She didn't wear her judicial robe outside of court, never had. She preferred to enter buildings like a citizen, calm, composed, and quietly observant. But as she approached the main entrance, the energy shifted. The moment Serena neared the security checkpoint, Deputy Hank Riker, broad-shouldered, stone-faced, and set in his ways, stepped forward. He didn't recognize her. More importantly, he didn't care to. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of line," he said, his tone more command than request. Serena paused, her expression unreadable. "Is there a problem, officer?" Riker's eyes scanned her from head to toe, her salt and pepper hair neatly twisted, her tailored slacks, the dignified calm in her eyes, and something about that calm unsettled him. She looked like she belonged, and in his world, someone like her needed to be reminded that she didn't. He dismissed her federal ID with a glance and slipped it into his pocket, ignoring her raised eyebrow and request to have it returned. Within moments, he had her pulled aside, away from the crowd, down a quiet hallway, and into a stark, windowless screening room. It was cold, clinical, still, and what happened next would change everything. Serena had entered that building as a citizen, but the men who laid hands on her were about to learn, far too late, that she wasn't just anybody. She was Judge Serena Whitfield, and justice was about to begin long before the court ever came to session. The courtroom buzzed with quiet chatter as attorneys shuffled papers, journalists adjusted camera lenses, and plaintiffs whispered anxiously among themselves. No one knew what had just happened in the side hallway minutes earlier, no one except the officers who had dragged a black woman into a windowless room and emerged moments later as if nothing had occurred. Most assumed she had been a disruptive visitor or perhaps a lost defendant. Certainly not someone of importance. So when the double doors opened wide and the woman they had barely noticed walked in, scalp unevenly shorn, blazer still buttoned, posture straight, an uneasy hush fell over the room. Serena Whitfield's heels echoed sharply against the polished marble as she strode past the gallery. Her face betrayed nothing. No rage, no sadness, just an eerie calm that unsettled those watching. She walked directly to the front of the courtroom, past the attorneys, past the clerks, and stepped behind the judge's bench. At first there was confusion, then recognition. A pin dropped somewhere in the gallery, and then silence. Complete, stunned silence. She didn't wait for anyone to announce her. She didn't need to. With slow, deliberate motion, Serena picked up the black judicial robe folded over the back of her chair, slipped her arms through the sleeves, and let it fall over her shoulders like armor. The courtroom staff, some of whom had laughed just hours earlier, suddenly stood frozen, their expressions shifting from amusement to dread. The bailiff, who had assaulted her, Deputy Hank Riker, stood by the side door. He went still as a statue the moment their eyes met. His mouth opened, but no words came. He had shaved her hair in humiliation. Now he was face to face with the federal judge he had tried to dehumanize. Serena turned to the court clerk. "Is the docket ready?" The clerk's voice cracked. "Yes, Your Honor." "Call the first witness." And just like that, the court was in session. But it wasn't just legal proceedings that had begun. It was a reckoning, one that no robe, badge, or courtroom tradition could prevent. Because Serena Whitfield hadn't come to participate in a system. She had come to correct it, and she was just getting started. The ripple effect started almost immediately. By noon, the footage of Judge Serena Whitfield silently reclaiming her seat, head bare, dignity intact, had begun to circulate on social media. Within hours, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division had issued an internal notice. Charleston Federal Courthouse was under review. What started as an isolated act of brutality by a single bailiff was now unraveling into something much larger. something systemic. Back in the courtroom, Serena remained composed, but her presence had shifted. She no longer represented just the bench. She had become the mirror to an institution long in denial. The air in the gallery grew heavier with each passing minute. A second witness testified to misconduct by officers during a protest, and Serena listened without interruption, her hands steady, her notes methodical. But from the corner of her eye she saw Hank Riker, the very man who had tried to humiliate her, shift nervously by the exit. His bravado had drained from his face. He could feel it. The storm he helped ignite was about to consume more than just him. After calling a short recess, Serena remained seated as the courtroom emptied. Only a few lingered. 2 junior officers, her clerk, and Riker. She turned her eyes to him at last. "Deputy Riker," she said, her voice razor-sharp. "Step forward." The room fell into pin-drop silence. Riker stumbled his way to the center, lips trembling. She didn't scream. She asked simple questions. How long he had served, how many women had passed through that screening room, how many complaints had been filed. 12, she said aloud, tapping her pen. 12 formal complaints, all buried, all ignored. And now you've added one more. To a federal judge. By the time she ordered the 2 remaining officers to place Riker under arrest, the courtroom had turned cold and still. The man who had held power with impunity for over a decade now stood in handcuffs, stripped not only of his badge, but of his illusion of untouchability. Serena didn't flinch, because this was no longer just about a single act of abuse. It was about exposure. It was about dismantling a hierarchy that protected the worst under the guise of order. And for the first time in years, the system was starting to feel the weight of its own silence. By the next morning, Charleston's courthouse no longer felt like the fortress of silence it once was. What began as a single incident in a side room was now unraveling into a full-blown exposure of corruption, complicity, and deeply rooted institutional bias. Inside Judge Serena Whitfield's chambers, stacks of files began to appear. Sealed complaints, anonymous memos, overlooked testimonies. Some were recent, others were over a decade old, but all pointed to the same pattern, a system that had chosen preservation over accountability. The most damning testimony came from Denise Talley, a former record supervisor at the courthouse. Middle-aged, sharply dressed, and quiet by nature, Denise had once worked just 2 floors below Serena. Now she sat under oath, steady in her truth. "I processed at least a dozen complaints against Deputy Riker," she told the court. "Some disappeared, some were marked resolved without investigation, and more than a few were buried on direct orders from Judge Terrence Mahoney." The gallery gasped. Mahoney wasn't just any judge. He was Serena's former mentor, her sponsor into the federal circuit. His reputation had been spotless. Until now. Denise didn't stop there. She spoke of intern mistreatment, intimidation of witnesses, and the repeated dismissal of complaints, particularly those filed by people of color. "Every time I tried to raise concerns," she said, her voice cracking, "I was told the same thing. Don't shake the structure, it'll collapse." And now, it was collapsing. The courtroom buzzed with reporters and civil rights observers, their pens flying. Outside, a growing crowd of supporters gathered, some with signs, others with silence. They didn't need chants. The truth was loud enough. Serena listened carefully, her face impassive but her eyes burning with resolve. This wasn't about a single act anymore, it was about a pattern. And the public was finally watching. She didn't call for applause, she didn't offer comfort, she simply adjourned the session with a firm tap of the gavel. Change had begun, not through speeches but through truth. And now it was spreading beyond the courthouse walls, one testimony at a time. By the end of the week, the Charleston Federal Courthouse was no longer just the site of a misconduct trial, it had become the epicenter of a national reckoning. The rot wasn't limited to one bailiff, one courtroom, or even one decade. It was systemic, stretching deep into the roots of the very institution that claimed to uphold justice. Judge Serena Whitfield understood that now. She had seen the paperwork, the signatures, the memos stamped with phrases like lack of corroborating evidence and resolved internally. But she also held something new in her hands, authority that had been earned through suffering and clarity. In the next session, she didn't wear her robe. Instead, she stood before a full courtroom, press, plaintiffs, attorneys, students, and survivors, and introduced what she called the Monroe Mandate, named not after herself but after her late mother's maiden name, a quiet nod to the woman who taught her dignity without fanfare. The mandate required sweeping reforms, mandatory anti-bias training, psychological evaluations for all court officers, real-time tracking of complaints, and most of all, zero tolerance for discriminatory behavior in federal spaces. Serena's voice was calm but uncompromising. "This is not about revenge, it's about responsibility," she said. "We are not here to protect tradition. We are here to protect people." The courtroom didn't cheer. They didn't need to. The silence was heavier than applause, reverent, stunned, unified. She went further, announcing that all officials involved in suppressing misconduct reports, judges, prosecutors, administrative staff, would be subject to formal review and possible referral to the Department of Justice. That included her former mentor, Judge Mahoney. Outside, the steps of the courthouse had become a gathering ground for those long ignored. Protesters held signs that read, "Justice starts now," and 12 complaints, zero accountability. Inside, Serena stood taller than ever, not because she wanted to be seen, but because she refused to be unseen any longer. This wasn't just a courtroom proceeding, it was a system being held to account. And Serena Whitfield was no longer simply interpreting the law, she was rewriting the expectations for how justice should look and who it must include. When the courtroom reconvened on a rainy Monday morning, there was no dramatic music, no camera flashes, just the hum of expectation. The gallery was packed again, reporters shoulder to shoulder, law students scribbling notes, and survivors seated quietly in the front row. But this day wasn't about more testimony, it was about the verdict. And something deeper. Judge Serena Whitfield entered the room with quiet purpose. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every eye followed her as she stood without her robe and spoke not just as a judge, but as a human being. "This court finds Deputy Hank Riker guilty of abuse of power, violation of civil rights, and official misconduct," she stated clearly. Then came the sentence. 6 years for abuse of power, 5 years for civil rights violations, and 1 year for obstruction, 12 years total under federal law. But Serena didn't stop at the legal judgment. She looked Riker in the eyes, no longer in uniform, now just another man stripped of illusion, and said, "That's the law's answer. Now, here's mine." Her voice softened but carried. "You spent your career deciding who was worthy of dignity. You used your badge like a weapon and silence like a shield, but power without accountability is not justice. And today that silence ends." There was no applause, just stillness. It wasn't about revenge, and Serena made that clear. Justice, she reminded them, isn't measured solely in prison time. It's measured in how a system responds, reforms, and remembers. She held up a signed copy of the Monroe Mandate and made it official. New policies, new expectations, no more looking the other way. Outside the courthouse, the rain had lightened, and the crowd stood quietly, some with umbrellas, others just letting the drops fall. They weren't there for spectacle, they were there for truth. And as Riker was escorted out, cuffed and silent, they watched not a man being punished, but a symbol of unchecked power finally held accountable. Justice had been served, but more importantly, it had been redefined. In the days that followed the trial, the Charleston Federal Courthouse felt different. The architecture hadn't changed, but the atmosphere had. There was a quiet awareness now, a shift in how people walked the halls, how they addressed one another, how they acknowledged the woman who had redefined what justice could mean. Judge Serena Whitfield had not just handed down a sentence, she had ignited a transformation. Her story had gone viral, but she didn't seek fame. She declined interviews, turned down television specials, and ignored book deals. Instead, she returned to work, reviewing motions, hearing civil disputes, guiding legal interns with patience and precision. But something had changed. Every time she walked into a room, people stood, not just because of her title, but because of what she stood for. In her chambers one evening, her sister Nain arrived carrying a small pair of clippers. Serena's scalp still bore the uneven patches from that day, but she had made a choice. She wouldn't hide them. "You ready?" Nain asked gently. Serena nodded. Together they finished what had once been an act of humiliation, but this time it was done with purpose, control, and love. When she looked in the mirror afterward, Serena didn't see loss, she saw power. She saw truth. Her short-cropped silver hair, once a target of cruelty, now stood as a crown of resilience, and when she walked out of the courthouse the next morning, bareheaded under the Carolina sun, she was met not with stares of judgment, but nods of respect. A teenager waiting outside quietly removed her hoodie, revealing her own buzzed head. No words were exchanged, just a glance, a smile, a shared understanding. Later that month, Serena visited a local middle school to speak about courage. One student asked, "Do you still believe in the system?" She paused and said, "I don't believe in what it was, but I believe in what we can make it." Weeks later, the White House announced Serena would receive the Presidential Medal of Justice. She accepted it, not as a reward, but as a responsibility. Because Serena Whitfield didn't just survive the system, she reshaped it. And in doing so, she gave others permission to rise, to heal, and to believe again. The story of Judge Serena Whitfield reminds us that true justice is not found in titles, uniforms, or institutions. It's found in the courage to speak up when silence is easier. For many older adults, this message resonates deeply. We've lived through decades of change, seen progress and setbacks, and often questioned whether speaking out makes a difference. But Serena's journey proves that integrity, once tested, can become the very foundation of change. Her experience shows that healing, both personal and societal, requires accountability, not revenge. It teaches us that dignity can be reclaimed even after it's been stripped away, and that leadership often comes not from shouting the loudest, but from standing tall when others hope you'll shrink. Whether you're 70 or 17, you have a role to play in creating a more just world. Perhaps it's by mentoring someone younger, sharing your truth, or simply refusing to look the other way. Justice may begin in courtrooms, but it lives in our homes, our communities, and our everyday choices. Serena didn't set out to become a symbol, she simply refused to be erased. And that, in itself, is a legacy we can all strive to leave behind.